We're recording today on February the 17th, 2026. And the major news today is that the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. has died at age 84. Reporting indicates the family confirmed his death in a statement, and multiple outlets also note that the cause of death has not yet been disclosed.
When someone like Reverend Jackson dies, it immediately becomes more than an obituary. It becomes a discussion and an argument about eras. He belonged to the generation after the death of Martin Luther King that carried the civil rights movement from mass protest into institutional politics, and he remained visible long enough for people to debate whether he was best understood as a religious figure, a movement leader, party builder, or something like a public moral diplomat.
And from where I'm sitting as a young Black American, this really hits differently than just, oh, a famous person passed away. For a lot of our families, the civil rights movement isn't abstract. It's elders who remember what segregation felt like, parents who remember the voter registration fights, and a kind of community muscle memory about how you survive and organize. Jackson's name lives on inside that memory, even for people who never voted for him or even liked him.
Yeah, that's a useful starting point because Jackson's public impact isn't only a set of policy wins, it's also about how he shaped civic identity, how people understood belonging, dignity, and political agency. He was a coalition builder and a communicator who could translate moral language into political participation, which is psychologically powerful because it changes what people think is possible for, quote, people like me, unquote.
Very well said, Dr. Weaver. Biographically, he was raised in the segregated South in Greenville, South Carolina, born in 1941, and his early life sits squarely in the Jim Crow world the movement for civil rights was trying to dismantle. He came into national prominence through the King era, working in the broader orbit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And after King's assassination, he becomes, for many Americans, one of the most recognizable faces and voices associated with civil rights activism and Black political aspirations.
Now, I want to underline something here about the Reverend piece from an African American viewpoint because it can get flattened. The Black church wasn't just a Sunday space. No, it wasn't. It was an organizing infrastructure. It was a training ground for leadership and often the safest institution we controlled locally. So when Reverend Jesse Jackson speaks, he's not only speaking as an individual, he's carrying a whole tradition of moral argument, community discipline, and public witnessing. And that is part of why his words landed so hard, for better or for worse.
Right. And that's also explains why his rhetoric mattered. Leaders who can create a shared we can mobilize people across differences, but the same visibility increases the stakes of any and every misstep. Coalition leaders demand careful language because it signals who is included, who is respected, and who is treated as expendable.
Institutionally, Jackson's post King work included building organizations that outlived single campaigns. He founded People United to Save Humanity, PUSH, and his Rainbow Coalition work, which later merged into what became the Rainbow PUSH Coalition. Those structures reflected a strategy: link civil rights to economic opportunity, education, and political participation, and build power by connecting constituencies that American politics often keeps separate.
Absolutely, Dr. Deneen. When people say rainbow, I hear a very serious claim that justice isn't one community's private request, it's a coalition project. And from inside black politics, that's always been a tightrope. You need allies, but you also need your own community to trust that you're not trading away the core issues like jobs, schools, housing, and voting rights for the sake of being called pragmatic. And Reverend Jesse Jackson's whole career sits inside that tension.
Well said. That tension becomes especially visible in his presidential runs. Jackson's campaigns in 1984 and 1988 weren't only about winning the nomination, they were also about demonstrating that a Black candidate could mount a national delegate based campaign that forced the party to reckon with Black voters as architects of strategy, not merely a reliable voting bloc.
Historically, that matters. He demonstrated that even earlier in campaigning for Mayor Harold Washington of Chicago. Contemporary reporting about Reverend Jackson's life emphasizes that those bids helped pave the way for later black candidates and altered expectations inside Democratic politics. I don't think there would have been a President Obama or a Vice President Harris without this. Even when he didn't win the nomination, he drew millions of votes and pushed issues: economic justice, civil rights enforcement, disability inclusion, and voter participation into the center of party debate.
And for black families, the point wasn't only, oh, our guy won. It's about seeing a serious national campaign that spoke to us directly without translating everything to someone else's comfort first. That kind of visibility can increase political participation because it tells people that the system is at least contestable, that you can enter it and bend it, not only endure it.
You know, Jackson also had a different kind of influence that's harder to categorize. Call it informal diplomacy. In the 1980s, he took on high profile efforts that helped secure the release of detained Americans overseas, including the release of U.S. Lieutenant Robert Goodman from Syria, which was publicly acknowledged at the time by the Reagan White House.
And his Cuba trip in 1984 is another example of that complicated space between moral activism and international politics. Contemporary reporting from that period and later retrospectives describe the trip as yielding the release of Americans held in Cuba, while also provoking a debate over precedent and legitimacy, whether such missions complemented official diplomacy or undercut it.
And from a black viewpoint, I think it's very important to say why that kind of unofficial power even existed at all. For generations, black leaders were often treated as outside the formal corridors of state power, but they built moral authority anyway. Authority rooted in community trust and global recognition of the civil rights struggle. Reverend Jackson could walk into rooms that some elected officials couldn't. Why? Well, because he carried that symbolic weight. That does not erase the controversy, but it does explain the mechanism.
You know, we also have to address controversies because a scholarly treatment can't turn away from them. One of the most consequential incidents was in 1984 when he used an anti Semitic slur referring to New York City, Hymietown, and later admitted making the remark, apologized, and intensified outreach to Jewish communities, even as debates persisted about the damage to the coalition trust.
Historically, that episode matters because it sits on an enduring fault line in American urban politics. Coalition building across Black and Jewish constituencies, debates over the Middle East, and the way one leader's language can reverberate through alliances far beyond the immediate campaign cycle. There is another version of that where African American leaders in both the Black Panthers and the right wing John Birch Society worked together to get the Rehabilitation Act passed. See our podcast about that if you want to learn more.
Absolutely. And I'm going to speak carefully here as a black commentator. This right here is exactly where leadership discipline is tested. In our community, we know what it is to be stereotyped and reduced by language. That makes it even more serious when leaders' words injure another community. Apologies matter, but trust isn't just a light switch. That incident didn't just harm him, it complicated the very coalition model that he was trying to sell.
Yeah, there were also personal scandals that became national news. In 2001, Jackson publicly acknowledged an extramarital affair and that he had fathered a child. He apologized to his family and to his followers.
The reason to mention that isn't voyeurism, it's because moral authority is part of how he led. When a leader's personal life contradicts the moral expectations attached to their public role, especially as a minister, it becomes historically relevant because it changes how institutions, donors, allies, and even ordinary supporters interpret the leader's message.
But I have to say, though, Dr. Deneen and Dr. Weaver, the fact that that is being put out there, it also lets people know that, hey, Reverend Jesse Jackson was not perfect. He was a human being just like all of us, and he makes mistakes just like everyone else. And I think that's important for everyone to keep in mind. Wouldn't you agree?
It is.
I would agree, yes.
And it's to his credit that he admitted it. People could have very easily
Absolutely.
lied, covered it up, bought someone off. But to say, look, I did something I shouldn't have and I'm sorry for it, that's the way any decent human being tries to act. We're all sinners, we're all going to make mistakes, but it's better to face up to it.
And in my opinion, that does command respect.
Hmm.
In black public life, that kind of scandal also lands in a painful way because we've had so few leaders treated as fully legitimate by the wider society. That is very sad too. And when one of the most visible figures stumble, then some people feel a sense of personal embarrassment, like it would be used as ammunition against the whole entire community. But at the same time, grown folks also know that movements don't rest on a single person's purity, and that does not excuse harm, but it does shape how grief and criticism can coexist.
On the recognition side, Jackson's role became thoroughly national. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2000, and accounts of his life often link that to his long record of civil rights activism and public service, including his work on releases of detained Americans abroad, which I previously mentioned.
In his later years, his health became part of the public story. He announced in 2017 he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and later reporting described how the diagnosis was ultimately understood in the context of progressive supranuclear palsy, a rare neurodegenerative disorder. Recent coverage notes that his PSP diagnosis was made public in connection with hospitalization and later updates.
Now, from a black family perspective, seeing a leader age and struggle with illness can feel pretty intimate. Our elders carried so much, like segregation, movement work, political backlash, and then watch the body finally demand its due. It doesn't change the historical record, but it does change its emotional tone of how people talk about legacy, because it reminds you about how the movement was made by human beings who paid real costs.
There's also the organizational question of succession. Reporting indicates that in 2023, he announced he was retiring from leadership of the Rainbow Push Coalition, which forces any long-running organization to confront whether it can sustain mission and credibility beyond its founder's personal stature.
So, what do we do with the legacy, holding the achievements and the controversies at the same time? If you're telling the story of late 20th century American civil rights activism and Democratic Party coalition politics, Reverend Jackson is unavoidable. His life shows the long arc from protest to party politics and also the risk of becoming the symbol who has to keep multiple constituencies in the same tent.
And from an African American viewpoint, I'd put it like this. Reverend Jackson helped expand the idea of who gets to speak in the national we. Now, that's not the same as saying he was flawless, because he admitted himself that he wasn't. But it is saying that millions of black people saw a door open a little wider into voting, into national campaigns, and into the expectation that our issues are not side issues. Even the arguments about him are evidence of impact, because people don't argue that hard about someone who didn't move the room.
We'll close there. Details surrounding his death may continue to develop, and assessments will continue to evolve. Our aim today was to keep the picture complete: movement leadership, coalition strategy, presidential politics, informal diplomacy, public honors, controversies, and the human realities of aging and illness, without flattening him into either a saint or a scandal.
Goodbye, Reverend Jackson. I urge our audience to take a moment, pay their respects, and remember his contributions.
Goodbye, and thank you, Reverend Jackson. To our audience, I ask, please join us again.
Goodbye, Reverend Jackson, and thank you for paving the way for young African Americans such as myself. And to our audience, come back soon, folks. We've got a lot of good stuff coming up.